Well, hello, we are live. This is Ray, the producer, and welcome to a very special show with the one and only Wendy Doniger. I will have Wendy on in a moment. Thanks for joining us. We have a lot of people in the chat, a very vibrant chat. So your comments are welcome. Wendy Doniger, for those of you who've been living under a rock, is one of the world's preeminent Indologists. She's written one of my favorite books, The Hindus, an alternative history. And she's recently published An American Girl in India, which is really just a love letter to India. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Doniger to the show. Professor, thank you so much for being a part of our silly little channel, and it means the world to me. Thank you.
Glad to have your interest.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's get going. Without further ado, we don't need to spend a lot of time on intros. People can look you up if they don't know who you are. A lot of the people in the chat already do. Wendy, Professor Doniger, has written, as I mentioned, The Hindus and Alternative History. She's written The Ring of Truth, Myths of Sex and Jewelry. She's written Beyond Dharma. She's written The Dream Narrative, The Dreams of God and Mortals in Classical Hinduism, and authored what I believe is the definitive translation of the Rig Veda. And we'll get into what these things are for people who are curious about Hinduism, for people who have preconceived notions about Hinduism, for people who are coming from a comparative religion background, people who are coming from a rational background. I figured, what better way than the authority on the subject. And again, thank you so much, Professor Doniger, for being a part. So my first question to you is that your latest book, An American Girl in India, Letters and Recollections, 1963 to 1964. These were written by a 22-year-old you. You arrived in Calcutta in August of 1963. Tell me, what was that like? How did you? I mean, what was going through your mind? Because you'd never been outside of the United States.
This book is based upon the letters I wrote to my parents, but they were lost for many years. I wrote them in 1963. My mother kept them. And when she died, apparently they came to me, but they were in a big box. And I never found them until 2018, when I retired from the University of Chicago, and I found a box. And I opened it up, and there was a letter, and it said, Calcutta, December 10th, 1963, Dear Mommy and Daddy. And these were this rather childish letters that I had written home to my parents on my first trip to India. And here I read them again 60 years later. And at first I was appalled at how stupid I was, how naive I was, what a spoiled brat I was. I'd never really been out of New York. I'd never been away from home. I was homesick. I wrote these letters to my parents, Mommy and Daddy. And there were parts of the letters which I was really embarrassed by. At the same time, they were so full of passion and interesting facts of the people I met and the things I saw and my ideas about architecture and my ideas about the climate. And I met wonderful people and had conversations with them. And I started discovering the Hindu myths, a lot of stories about Shiva, stories about the birth of the gods, stories about the mare who gave birth to twins and then ran away from her husband and all of that. So there was the heart of what I was going to unpack for 50 years. So on the one hand, they were stupid and I was young. On the other hand, you could see the seeds of who I was going to become. And I thought it would be interesting, for one thing, for my many students to see that you can be really wrong about things in the beginning, but you can correct those mistakes as you go on. When I retold the stories later on, I got them right. Half of them were mistold in this book. I say that Shiva did this, and it's not exactly the way the story goes. So it's partly about looking back upon our own pasts upon our racist and sexist past, all the things we're trying to correct now, but not throwing the past away, saying we were wrong, but we were on the track of something good. And this is the seed of something good in my life, my love of India, my ongoing interest in Indian stories and in Hinduism. So I thought it was worth sharing with a broader audience, in particular my students, but other people. It's dedicated to my students who are also young in India, as well as to my very brave publisher, Ravi Singh, who republished the Hindus when it was in trouble and so forth. So it's a present back to all the people that helped me through all these years in my study of India and helped me write the books. Um, it's really the other end of my life, really.
No, I was reading it, and I'd like to read a couple of passages from in a little bit. But it really it's a love letter to India,
It is.
and its people and its culture, and I come from a Pakistani background. I was born in Pakistan, but I was raised all over the world, and I've always found Hinduism to be so colorful, and that with their gods and their myths and the Ramayana and the Bharat and all of these wonderful epics. It's almost like a Game of Thrones before J.R.R. Martin even thought of that, of the
It's the most
concept.
interesting religion in the world. There's no question about it. That's a
It
fact.
really
That's
is.
not
And
an opinion. That's a fact.
it really is. And especially coming from an Islamic background where, any depiction of Muhammad gets you in hot water. I found it to be very refreshing. I had a lot of very good friends who were Hindu. But what triggered your? I mean, you were 22 years old, and you decided that you were going to go to
India.
India.
Mhm.
Where did that come from? Where did your interest and your love for India and Hindu culture stem from?
It came from several different places. It came, first of all, from books I read. My mother gave me a copy of A Passage to India when I was very young. And I also read a translation of the Upanishads in what I now realize was a very bad translation, the Juan Maspero translation, but I thought it was fascinating. I loved languages. In high school, I took Latin. My Greek teacher, my Latin teacher taught me Greek as well as Latin, and she said, "Well, if you liked," and I loved Greek. I liked it better than Latin. It had a funny script. It was older. It was more difficult to read. And she
Right.
said, "Well, if you like languages, Indo-European languages that have funny scripts and are old, you ought to like Sanskrit." And I said, "What is Sanskrit?" And my young Latin teacher said, "Well, Sanskrit is the language of ancient India." And that was the India that I was already getting to be interested in other ways. Um, and then also having been raised in a very political family, being very political myself in my youth, I kind of ran away from all that. I decided that I wanted to go someplace long ago and far away. I wanted to get out of the present and New York. And the farthest I could imagine going was to ancient India. And the best way I could get to ancient India was to get to India. So I loved the excesses of India. I love the way that their paintings had lots and lots and lots of people all over them instead of European paintings where you had a portrait of a single person. I thought that was boring. I thought Indian paintings
Yeah.
were much more interesting. And Indian music was more interesting than European music. European music had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes, and Indian music. I write a lot about Indian music in the book because I met Ali Akbar Khan and I learned to play the sarod. Indian music
All
goes
right.
right up the scale. I love that there weren't separate notes, but the sliding sounds and Indian stories. European stories. Once upon a time, there was a king and he did this, but Indian stories were full of magic and imagination and humor and excess. So I just loved all the multiplicity of Indian culture, the fact that everything had thousands of parts in it, that you could never get to the end of it. And I love the colors. I mean, I love that Indian saris would be purple and yellow and red and green. Whereas in the America that I grew up with, you have to wear basic black or maybe a little
Right.
gray if you're really going to be dangerous. And I would put purple on with a yellow scarf. And people would say, what, are you going to the circus or something dressing like that? So I liked saris. I liked them better than Western clothes. I liked Indian food better than the food I knew. I loved eating with my fingers. I'm very clumsy and I could never manage knives and forks. And I thought it was just great that you could use your right hand, mind you, but you could use your hand in India. So the whole culture really appealed to my own particular personality. And I loved it from afar since I went to college at 17 and I majored in Sanskrit. But when I was 22, I finally got to India, in real India, in person. And it was a bit of a shock for me because I went to Calcutta, which at that time had enormous slums. And I'd never really seen an American slum. I was a very sheltered person and I had to never been begged for. I'd never seen beggars. I mean, there are beggars in America. There are slums in America.
And you're very honest about this in your book. You called yourself a Jewish princess.
Jewish American princess, absolutely. I had been sheltered from things that were available to me in America, but I didn't know them. So it was a double shock. Not only was I shocked because India is a different culture, but I was shocked to experience poverty for the first time in my life. So there was a lot to digest in those months in India, and the letters reflect how I denied it at first. I'm not homesick. I said, there are people here, even the poor people, they have enough to eat, and I just didn't know what I was talking about. And gradually, I did learn a lot of things, and I began to understand India a lot better. So even in that brief period, the letters change.
Right.
And I did learn a lot, and I came back a sadder but wiser person, but still someone who loved India even more than when I had gone out. In the beginning, I felt guilty that I couldn't love everything about India because I knew I loved India, but I didn't love the poverty and I didn't love the begging. And I had to kind of come to terms with appreciating the parts of India that I loved and saying there are parts that, as someone raised in the West, I can't really go with.
Right. And to put things in perspective, I feel the same way about the United States. This is my adopted homeland. I became a citizen back in 2008, and I absolutely adore this country. But at the same time, true love means acknowledging what could be improved upon, acknowledging what we've been talking about gun violence, for example. This is a huge problem in America. We're talking about income inequality. We're talking about race relations. These are all issues, reproductive rights. So loving your country doesn't mean jingoism, doesn't mean beating your chest, and doesn't mean flying the flag and, rah, rah, America. That's not loving your country. That's being a boor. Loving a country, loving a culture means to be able to love it, analyze it critically, and to be able to say, well, like Professor Doniger said, we're here today because of where we were. And you're never going to be able to move forward if you don't understand why you're where you are. So, Professor Doniger, as a follow-up question to that, did you study Hinduism in a sort of a secular way, the way I'm reading your books, the way I read the Old Testament or commentaries on the Bible? As a former Muslim, I'm an atheist now, but I still have a Quran here, but I read it in a secular way, to try to understand when I'm dealing with certain people, or when I worked in countering violent extremism, to try and understand, okay, this is where they're coming from, this is why they believe what they believe. So did you study Hinduism? Were you a practicing Hindu, or were you more of a secular a student or scholar of the religion?
Well, it's a good question. I was a secular student of it. I didn't become a convert. At the same time, I had never been raised in my own Jewish tradition. I didn't believe that the Old Testament had the truth, or the New Testament either. And over the years, as I read the Hindu texts, a great deal of them made more sense to me than any of the Christian or Jewish texts ever had.
Interesting.
It seemed to me, for instance, that the theory of the Kali Yuga, the theory of the inevitable degeneration of time, that when the world was created, it was perfect, but people made a mistake. There was no apple, there was no Eve, there was no serpent. It's just that people couldn't go on being good. They were created good, and in time, they just couldn't keep it up. And that made more sense to me than a serpent or an apple, let alone a wicked woman. And that right now, we've hit bottom, and that people are not good anymore, and that there's no way back to the golden age, that it went down, and down is where it is now. And that always seemed to me a much better explanation of the evil in the world than the Christian or Jewish theories of it. I wrote a book eventually, The Origins of Evil in Hindu Mythology,
Right.
talking about how much sense the Hindu ideas about evil in the world meant to me. I also really loved the god Shiva. There are many different, sorry about this.
That's all right.
Um, I thought I had turned it off, but I haven't. Let me turn it off now for sure.
Not a problem. Not a problem.
Um, I thought that Shiva really represented the way, if there is a God, that was what God must be like. That he wasn't a guy with a long beard, that he wasn't Jesus who allowed himself to be crucified for our sins, that he was this spectacular creature who danced the world into existence and who could also dance it out of
The
existence.
destroyer god.
A
Yes.
destroyer, absolutely, and also a wonderful God, a brilliant and a God you could fall in love with, as well as a God that you knew was going to destroy you. So I thought, as an image of divinity, that made the most sense to me. And then I just loved the stories. I just thought that the stories that I read were more interesting to me than the stories in the Bible, in either the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, or the New Testament. I just thought there was a lot of truth in the texts. I loved the Upanishads. Even as a little girl, I loved the Upanishads, and I love them still. That they have a sense of the way the individual soul is part of the soul of the world, the way the images of you put salt in water and then you say, where is the salt? And you can't find it. Um, so I came to find my meanings for a lot of the great human questions in the text of Hinduism, but I was never a worshiper. Whenever I went to a temple, I gave something to the god.
Right.
You'd be foolish not to. You got to, take all the options you have. So I did that, but I didn't worship in any particular way. So I have a lot of fun. Well, there's an image of Shiva right over there. I'll do this just quickly. Can you see him there? Is he there, Shiva?
Yes. Yes.
You can
Yes,
see
I
him.
can. Yes, I
There
can.
he is. So there he is. So I just have him there. He's always there.
So,
That's,
what's,
yes.
yes, go ahead, please.
But I never became a Hindu. For one thing, most Hindus through most of Indian history have believed you can't become a Hindu, you have to be born a Hindu. And there has never been, until just recent centuries, there's never been Hindu conversion. You can convert to Buddhism, you can convert to Jainism, and of course to
But
other.
all that's changing now. There's this new
That's
movement in India that they call it the return,
Yeah,
homecoming, Garvapsi,
yeah.
and this is
That's
uh,
quite recent. The Hinduism that I studied, ancient Hinduism, had no idea about conversion.
and I belong to the, obviously my knowledge is minuscule compared to yours, but absolutely, I mean, this is how we grew up as well. Hindus were more cultural Hindus, as opposed to there's a word for it, orthodox versus orthoprax.
Yeah.
And you see that in Judaism as well. You see a lot of secular Jews who are Jewish as a cultural identity.
Yeah.
and
It's
and
always
not
been the case in Hinduism, that it mattered very much what you did. It didn't really particularly matter what you thought. That's always been the way that the religion has been. And they can be very rigid about making mistakes. People get killed for doing the wrong thing. But for most of Hinduism, no one ever got killed for believing the wrong thing. There wasn't any wrong thing to believe. You believe what you believe, and another person believe what they believe. So
Right, and that's what they'll tell you. They'll, a lot of the sort of very fundamentalist Hindus, and we'll talk about that in a second, make reassuring noises about that.
mhm.
But as you know, I noticed from even before the show started, some of the comments were so angry. And I haven't, had that same kind of feedback from my Muslim shows. I did a show where I said, "Is the Islamic God actually the angel Gabriel?" And I had people, Muslims come on and they argued with me and they weren't too happy about it. But I didn't see this sort of a thing. So it really is um, surprising. But
It's a very recent and very modern phenomenon for Hindus to behave like that.
it
But
is a very recent
most of
phenomenon.
history, they've been the most tolerant and nicest people I know.
Absolutely. And that was my experience.
It's nothing new.
One of my Hindu best friends was a Sindhi Hindu. They were vegetarians. I used to spend a lot of weekends with him because he had a Nintendo Entertainment System, which I loved, and I didn't have one. I spent a lot of my weekends with him. His mom used to make chicken for me, even though they never ate chicken, but she would cook chicken for me, and because she thought I liked chicken. And I told her, I said, "Look, I love vegetables. You've lived in India. You know how great the dal is, the bhindi, the eggplant. Their vegetables are better than meat." But that was the level of tolerance and love and acceptance. So I want to move this forward since we started talking about what it means to be a Hindu. Let me ask you sort of to ask you to educate not just the non-Hindus and the secular people like myself and some of our friends. Rustam Shah is in the audience. Hello, Rustam. John Stockman. Thanks for joining us, and all of our other friends as well. I really appreciate you being here. And Aziz Marani is here. Be patient, hear us out, and see where we go with this before you jump to conclusions. So Hinduism is vast, and it's probably like no other religion, Professor Doniger. If you will, please educate our audience on what Hinduism actually is, what it means. For those of us who don't know our Shrutis from our Smritis, what's in the Vedas and the Upanishads, the Puranas? Why are there so many different books, and what does this mean to the Hindu of today in India? The sort of the cultural Hindu, or just the person that just wants to get on with his or her day, if you know what I mean.
Well, as we said, the heart of Hinduism is not what people write and read and believe, but what they do. So, in a sense, the answer to what it is to be a Hindu is to be a person who does certain things, who comes from a certain kind of a family, has a certain kind of tastes, and worships a certain god. Sometimes several members of a family will worship different gods. Sometimes a woman who marries will come to her husband's house and worship the gods in her husband's house instead of that. Many Hindus worship many different gods on different occasions. Everybody worships Ganesha before you begin some new enterprise. He's an elephant-headed god, and he rides on a bandicoot, a great big rat. So he's the remover of obstacles. If an elephant with his trunk can go through the jungle and a rat can eat through anything. So no matter what kind of Hindu you are, and indeed very often Muslims and Christians in India will also, and Jews will worship Ganesha. So it's not who you worship that makes you a Hindu, because Hindus will often worship at Sufi shrines and they'll worship different gods. Some Hindus will worship Vishnu, but on Shiva's birthday, on Shivaratri, everybody worships Shiva. So it's not a matter of what god you worship. It's certainly not a matter of what texts you read. There is no Hindu Bible. There are so many Hindu texts. It begins with the Rig Veda, the oldest of Hindu texts, in fact, one of the oldest of any Indo-European text. Most Hindus don't read the Rig Veda. There's one Vedic hymn, the Savitri or the Gayatri, Tat Savitur Varenyam, that most Hindus, many Hindus recite at dawn. Some of them don't even know the meaning of the words. So it's not the words, it's not the prayers, it's not what God you worship. It's more the world you live in and the understanding that people who are also Hindus like you will worship differently and will read different texts and will memorize different texts, will speak different languages. Some Hindus know Sanskrit. Most Hindus, if they know the Sanskrit text, they know them in translation. The Ramayana is an important text. Some Hindus read it in Sanskrit. Some Hindus read it in Tamil. Some in Bengali. So there's not a Bible. There's never been a Hindu Bible. The British thought there should be a Bible because they had a Bible. So when they came to India, they said to some Brahmin, "Do you have a Bible?" And he said, "Yes, it's the Laws of Manu," which was an old textbook of dharma, which is by no means, it's not a Bible at all. So the British said, "We're going to rule India by its own Bible. We're going to rule India by Manu," and thereby destroyed the whole Indian legal system, which didn't use Manu at all. So there's no one way of being a Hindu. The whole point of it is that it's enormously tolerant of a range of beliefs. There is no pope. There is a Brahmin in your town, your village, who probably has a lot of authority and someone you might consult. Is it okay to marry this person? Is it okay to eat this food? Remember, we're talking about people who are orthoprax, who care about what they do, and Brahmins are the authority on that. But there's no unified system. There never has been. I realize some people think there should be, but there never has been a central authority, a unified system. There has never been one way of being a Hindu. There are different traditions in every village. There are different traditions in every century. There are different translations. There are new texts. New saints arise, holy men. Suddenly there's a shrine to that holy man. Everybody worships there. It's one of the things I love about Hinduism is that it's so polymorphous. It's so various. There are so many different ways, so it's almost impossible for anybody who has any religious feeling at all to fail to find something in Hinduism that you can latch onto if you're looking for a meaningful religion. It's an infinitely flexible and creative religion.
Right, and it's such a stark contrast from something like Islam, where you have the Sharia and you have the Hadiths, and that's it.
Christianity or Judaism, you've got the Hebrew Bible and you've got the traditions of the rabbis. Christianity has its variations too, as we know, but there is in many ways a central source and an ultimate limit to how far you can go. And as far as I can tell, in Hinduism, there's really no limit at all. It's an infinitely creative religion. There are many texts that many Hindus know and love. There is, for instance, this Gayatri that you're supposed to recite at dawn. Nowadays, many Hindus think that the Bhagavad Gita is the Bible, but in fact, the Gita has never been central to Hindu worship until very, very recently, really until the British. For 2,000 years, there were lots of other texts that was much more important.
Right. And that's interesting because the Bhagavad Gita, for a lot of our non-Hindu friends, is, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's just a part of the Mahabharata. It's just one chapter of the Mahabharata. It's really called the Bhishma Parva, which is essentially one of the chapters. And the whole thing takes place. Tell us, Professor, I know, there is no Bible in Hinduism, but a lot of Vaishnava Hindus do take the Bhagavad Gita.
Nowadays, a lot of people think the Bhagavad Gita is the Bible, but that's a modern, a recent thing. For most, Hinduism has a history of thousands and thousands of years. It goes back to the Veda in about 1500 BCE. That gives you lightning calculation, 3,500 years of Hinduism. And in the last 200 years, many Hindus regard the Bhagavad Gita as a kind of Bible. Until then, it's been an important part of a great text, the Mahabharata. And it's a funny moment in the Mahabharata because the hero Arjuna has as his charioteer a man named Krishna. And for most of the Mahabharata, Krishna is just a prince. He's Arjuna's cousin. His mother is married to Krishna's father's sister. It's one of those big Indian families.
Right.
He's just a guy. And he's in particular a rather dishonest and tricky guy. He's a kind of a lawyer or a politician. He makes deals in various ways.
Right. It's like Game of Thrones, right?
Yes. In parts of the Mahabharata, he's regarded as an incarnation of Krishna. Another book that I'm actually publishing this summer is a translation of the last books of the Mahabharata. It's called After the War, the last books of the Mahabharata. And in the last books of the Mahabharata, Krishna is indeed God. He's God with a capital G.
Mm.
And he knows that a battle is going to be fought that is going to destroy everything. And he doesn't try to stop it, although he could, because he is God with a capital G, because the very fact that he is God means that he knows that this war is going to take place. He knows everything. He knows that it has to take place. So when Krishna does become deified in the final books of the Mahabharata, he doesn't try to save the world. And indeed, he dies and his soul goes up to heaven and his body is left behind like the body of anybody else. So the Mahabharata has a double view of Krishna, both as a tricky, no, he's not dishonest. He's actually dishonest. He's actually dishonest. He's a tricky and slightly dishonest prince, but at the
He's a
same
politician, basically.
he's a politician. But at the same time, he is God, omnipotent, who knows, and omniscient, and so forth. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna first thinks that Krishna, who's driving his chariot, he's like his bodyguard. So the chariot had two guys on it. The warrior stood up with his bow and arrow. He needed both hands, one on the bow, one on the arrow, duh. And he needed to drive his chariot another guy who, on the one hand, held the reins of the horses in his hand, and in his other hand, held a shield that protected the two of them. So he's his bodyguard, he's his right-hand man, he's his best friend. And when Arjuna faces the battle, he realizes that he's going to have to kill his friends and his relatives, his teachers. It's a fraternal battle. It's a battle within the family. And he says, quite sensibly, it seems to me, I don't want to do this. I don't want to kill all my friends. He says, I'm not going into this battle. And Krishna says, you've got to go into this battle. And he explains in the Bhagavad Gita that it's his dharma, it's Arjuna's duty to do it because he's a warrior and that's what warriors do. Right. He also says, it's not going to do any harm. You'll just kill their bodies. The soul is eternal. There's a whole doctrine of what happens to the soul when you die. And basically he persuades him to fight. And at one point, Arjuna says, how do you know this? And Krishna says, I am God. And he shows him his divine image, which is infinitely big and full of flames and a great mouth, which is gobbling up all the armies that there are. And Arjuna says, stop. I don't want to see you like this. Would you just be my friend, Krishna, again? Let me forget that you're God. And Krishna says, fine. And he erases from Arjuna's memory the vision of himself as God. And Arjuna then goes into the battle and starts killing people. And that is the Bhagavad Gita. So it's a book that justifies war by the doctrine of the eternal reincarnation of the soul. And it has other things in it as well. It's 18 chapters. It's not just one chapter. It's 18 chapters.
The Mahabharata, right?
But it's a strange book. It's a very interesting book. There's a lot of wisdom in it, but ultimately it is the use of religion to justify war.
So tell us, Professor Doniger, who were the combatants in this Dharam Yudh, this religious war? Who were the parties, and why were they fighting?
Two cousins fighting for a kingdom. Nothing religious about it at all. They were cousins. There was a dice game. The guy cheated in the dice game. The king, who was a bad gambler anyway, a compulsive and bad gambler, gambled away everybody. He and his brothers had to go into exile with their wife. And it was just a a war like other wars, like wars going on all over the world today. It was a battle for territory, for power, and for money. It was not a religious war at all. And indeed, in the end, that's what I'm writing about in these final books. In the end, nobody won. Everyone on both sides was killed. There were just a few people left, just a little. And the ones who won, the 5 Pandava brothers, finally climbed up to heaven. And when they got to heaven, they met the other side there. And they said, well, what's the point of going to heaven if our enemies are there? And the gods say, there is no such thing as vengeance in heaven. You've got to forgive these people. It's true, they killed your people, you killed their people. The war has got to stop. It's a wonderful, wonderful explanation of the need to give up. Well, it's really about peace and reconciliation. It's really about what we're talking about all over the world. Because they killed your guys, you're going to kill their guys. It all ends in the Mahabharata. In heaven, none of this matters. It's a wonderful book, really, really wonderful. It's a book about war, and it ends with a complete condemnation of war.
So, what does, oh, I love that. It's a book that begins with war and ends with complete condemnation of war.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how, the Hindu of today, if there is such a thing, sees the Bhagavad Gita? What message do you think Hindus take from the Bhagavad Gita? It's as close to a definitive text, some say, as the Bible in Hindus, and some say it isn't, as you've pointed out. I mean, it's horses for courses. But what is the takeaway, and what is the sort of, like when Muslims read the Quran, they're supposed to not read it with translation because you can only get the message in Arabic, that sort of thing. What does it mean to Hindus when they read the Bhagavad Gita?
Well, as I say, for those Hindus who regard the Bhagavad Gita as their central text, which is by no means most Hindus, the central message is really the message which you could also get from the Upanishads. Long ago, Upanishads were composed in the 6th century BC, and that's where the core of the Hindu doctrine of the immortality of the soul, the idea of rebirth, the idea that the body is not important, the idea of karma, the idea that what you do in this life will go on to determine how you will be born in your next life, and indeed what will also happen to you later in this life. I think those doctrines which are central to Hinduism from the time of the Upanishads, are also central to the Bhagavad Gita. The idea of the incarnate God, that Krishna is in fact God and that he appears as a human being. Vishnu has many other incarnations as well, but Krishna is the one. Well, Rama is perhaps the most important of all of Vishnu incarnations. So I think they get that doctrine, which is shared by a lot of Hindus who have never read the Bhagavad Gita, who have never read the Upanishads, who really have this certain shared concept of the immortality of the soul, of the transmigration of the soul, and for some Hindus, some but not all, the idea that transmigration is not a solution but a problem. That we think of it, I think people in the West think that rebirth is a good thing. We're frightened of dying, and the thought that you'll have another life is encouraging. Well, I'm sorry to die, but I'll be alive again. But that's not how it's presented in the classical Hindu texts. To be born again, they originally call it not rebirth, they call it re-death. Do you really want to die over and over and over again? And so the idea that there is re-death is immediately matched with the idea that there's a way not to have re-death. And that is called moksha, release or freedom. This is in the Bhagavad Gita as well. And the idea is that if you live a good life and don't amass a lot of bad karma, your soul is in some ways clean when you die. And then you will be released, and it's not at all clear what will happen to you when you're released. You simply will not be reborn, but you don't exactly go to heaven and you don't exactly disappear. It's just hard to figure out what happens. But that's in the Gita too. It's in the Upanishads and it's in the Gita that there is rebirth, that there need not be rebirth, and that if you don't want to be reborn, you have to live a very pure life. There are a lot of rules for the life that you want to lead if you don't want to be reborn. Basically, you shouldn't marry, you shouldn't have children, you should be free of all human attachments. And that's in the Gita too, and most people do not do that and do not.
Right. Because it's impractical to be a brahmachari is
Difficult, and it means you lose out on a lot of the fun. And Hindus enjoy life.
yes.
They're great cooks, and they enjoy music and dancing. So that message of the Gita, that you want to live an ascetic life in order not to be reborn, is acceptable only to a very few people. I think there are some. There are indeed some.
Right, and there, but at least to my knowledge, there wasn't that sort of you have to do it this way.
No,
Hindus who chose that path they chose that path. They didn't try to impose
no.
their beliefs or their way of life onto other people, like we have in Afghanistan with the Deobandi Taliban, who are forcing everybody else to live the way they want to live. At least not until recently.
There's also another escape clause in a way in the Bhagavad Gita, which is the concept of what's called nishkama karma, which
Mhm.
is you do the action, the karma, you do it, and you do it without desire, nishkama, that your emotions are pure. So, for instance, Arjuna goes into battle simply because it's his job to go into battle, not because he wants to or he's going to get something from it. And that in a way, you can move through life without getting burdened with this karma that sticks to your soul. You can sort of swim through it without accumulating anything. If your heart is pure, if you don't have desire, you can still do your job. In fact, you can marry and have children and make money if your heart and your mind are in the right places, which is what nishkama means. So that also is message of the Gita. The Gita is a complicated book, an interesting and complicated book.
So let's talk about some of these other books. I mean, it is truly mind-boggling. You've got the four Vedas, you've got the Puranas, the 18 Mahapuranas and the 18 Upapuranas, the minor and the major, the Upanishads, also known as the Vedanta. There's 12 Mukhya Upanishads, the important ones, and there's 108 unimportant ones. Then we have the Itihasa, which you've so brilliantly explained in your book, that it really doesn't mean his history. It just means what was said.
What was said.
Right.
You're
So,
just listing the Sanskrit texts. Most of Hinduism is not in Sanskrit. When you say the Ramayana, you're not just talking about Valmiki. You're
right.
probably talking about Tulsi in Hindi and Kampan in Tamil. That's how most Hindus know the Ramayana. And in fact, more of them know the Ramayana from the television Ramayana.
I do.
Yeah. So you're just listening to Sanskrit texts that no one reads. No one knows all of Sanskrit literature. It's just
Right. And I'd like to, yeah,
and Hinduism is not all in Sanskrit either. So no one could possibly know all the Hindu texts. It's
right.
just
And one of my favorite things in your book, where you talked about Prakriti, Prakrit versus Sanskrit, which is the pass the butter language.
that's right.
Brahmins didn't use Sanskrit in the kitchen.
That's
It
right.
was it was, I mean, I don't know if you want to compare it. Yeah, it was the priestly language, and there seems to be this deification of Sanskrit, and
No, it's a wonderful language.
yes,
I won't hear anything said against Sanskrit. What I find interesting is because no one ever only spoke Sanskrit. Anyone who spoke Sanskrit in India at any time, maybe in the Rig Veda, but not after the Rig Veda, if then, anyone who spoke Sanskrit also spoke another language in the house. And in addition, for most of India, most of the time, women did not speak Sanskrit. Ramanujan, my great colleague, A.K. Ramanujan, a great poet and scholar, spoke about the front rooms of the house and the back rooms of the house. In the front rooms of his house where the men were, they spoke Sanskrit. In the back rooms of the house, in the kitchens where the women were, they spoke Prakrit. But every Brahmin had a mommy. Every Brahmin was raised by a woman and or a nurse. And so any man that wrote Sanskrit texts, preached about Sanskrit texts, that used Sanskrit text, any man also knew some other language, had been raised by a mother, and so who knew some other language, and who knew the folk tales in another language. Women are storytellers. Women have always been storytellers. And so when you get the retelling of the Mahabharata, stories keep, by men, in Sanskrit, by men, stories keep getting into the Mahabharata, which are not originally Sanskrit stories, because the guys who put the Mahabharata together learned them from their moms. And so even Sanskrit literature has more and more what we call vernacular literature, folk literature, village literature, whatever you want to call it, secular literature. There's a lot in the Mahabharata, has nothing to do with religion. And it's wonderful. That's one reason why Sanskrit is so great, because it never dried up like Latin in the Middle Ages. It was constantly reinfused by the lower class literature, village literature, women's literature, and so forth. And then you have that other literature. You have Hindi literature, you have Tamil literature, you have Bengali literature. And all of these traditions have their own sacred texts, say their prayers in their own languages, have their own local gods that they worship. So there's this wonderful multiplicity of Hinduism to this day. And the idea of making a single Hinduism that everyone had to be the same in would be such a desecration. You couldn't do it. I think the good news is you couldn't possibly do it, but even to want to do it is to misunderstand what is really the soul of Hinduism.
And what, according to you, Professor Doniger, is the soul of Hinduism?
The soul of Hinduism is a great passion for a world which is not simply the world we see, a real interest in what's going on behind the scenes, as it were, above the scenes, below the scenes. And it's a very worldly religion. It's a very human religion. It's an enormously creative and imaginative religion. And it has one or two shared beliefs, like the idea of the transmigration of the immortal soul, on which infinite riffs can be played. And that's what Hinduism is.
Wonderful.
In my humble opinion.
I love it. I really do love it. We have some more questions. How are we doing for time, Professor? Are you good?
I think it's fine. I'm all right. I'll just have another drink. I haven't gone. The dog hasn't barked yet, so
You can take a couple of minutes break, and if you like, let me know. Happy to.
I'm okay. We may have to break the dog bark, so let's go as much as we can.
That's fine. So we talked about all the different texts. We talked about the meaning of Hinduism. My interest as a countering violent extremism, as a person who's interested in reform, as a person who is interested in religion as culture, as stories, as mythology. I'm as Kshitij Rana so brilliantly put it, that Mahabharata would be a great epic if people stopped associating religion with it.
Yeah, it's not particularly religious at all. It's a war epic.
But at the same time, you have all of these. In the Ramayana, the birthplace of Ram led to clashes in Ayodhya, led to the demolition of the mosque, and there's the temple versus mosque, controversy. And I don't want to get into politics, but I am interested in reform, and I wanted to do a bit of comparative religion here with you. So you see, Islam has, seen the rise of several revivalist movements. I say revivalist, quotation marks. Salafis, Wahhabis. This purifying, taking religion back to its fundamental roots. And by fundamental, I mean literalist roots. Is there such a movement in Hinduism, and where does it draw its inspiration from? Is it from Manusmriti? Is the Manusmriti like the Sharia of Hinduism, or is there no such thing? And why are we noticing this rise in literalism and fundamentalism in certain segments of Hindu society?
Hinduism itself is not fundamentalist. Hinduism is infinitely accommodating. everything comes into it and changes. When Islam came to India, lots and lots of Sanskrit texts and Hindi texts and Bengali texts started accommodating new ideas. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about horses in India, the history of horses, winged stallions and wicked mares, horses in Indian mythology. And I talked about how in the ancient period, the Vedic period, it was all about stallions. It was a macho religion. It was just warriors and horses and all of that. And they had no use for mares. Mares had a very bad press. But when the Turks and the Arabs came to India as merchants and as all sorts of things, long before there was any conquest, any battles fought, they brought Islam as soon as there was Islam, and they preferred mares. And the folk tales in Hindi and in Tamil and in Telugu, these great folk epics of warriors on horses, which had all been about warriors on their stallions, suddenly became stories about warriors on their mares. They're brilliant mares, they're self-sacrificing mares, they're understanding mares, and so forth. So you get all sorts of changes in Indian literature under the peaceful influence of Islam. You get architecture, Hindu temples being built differently because of the things they learned from the Arabs and the Turks who came in and so forth. So Hinduism throughout history has been extremely accommodating of other religions, as you would think it would be, given the structures, which are the man in the next village doesn't believe what I believe anyway. Hindus worshipped at Sufi shrines.
It's very syncretic, isn't it? It takes other traditions and other beliefs. And
so the idea that India is a Hindu nation is not a religious idea, it's a political idea. And it's a political fundamentalism. It has really nothing to do with Hinduism whatsoever. It has to do with anti-Muslim sentiment in the government, not among the people. When I was living in India, I didn't know half the time whether a person was a Muslim or a Hindu. We all had dinner together, and afterwards I'd find out, oh, that guy actually, he is a Muslim and so forth. So the religion of Hinduism itself is not at all jingoistic. And fundamentalism is a political movement, and it is politically motivated. And if it's part of the government of India, then these changes are going to be made until people change the government of India. And fundamentalism, as you well know, is not limited to India. It's happening all over the world. So this is a bigger trend than Hinduism. It's beyond Hinduism because it is political. It's beyond India because it is a worldwide trend. And India is just going to have to deal with it as best they can and to draw upon their own history of Hindu and Muslim cooperation over the centuries. People say that the British made it worse, and in some ways they did make it worse. They exacerbated tensions between Hindus and Muslims in some ways. The British themselves preferred the Muslims. They were monotheists, like the British, and they were great horsemen, like the British, which the Hindus, except for the Rajputs, great exception. Rajputs were fabulous horsemen, but Hindus, by and large, were not as horsey as the Muslims. So there was a lot of tension during the period of the Raj, where Muslims were given preference. Tensions build up. It's not that it's always been perfectly fine between Hindus and Muslims, but it has never been a real problem. And there's never been a question of India being a Hindu nation which has no place for Muslims in it, let alone Hindus and Jains and other religions, which Parsis, which have also thrived.
Yeah, because I say, that you've got to find rational people from both sides to move forward. This Hindutva, this cow slaughter thing, this is complete madness. This is the kind of thing that you hear from Taliban.
Yeah. In the old days, cows were sacrificed and eaten by everybody. That was part of the Vedic religion. One of the things you did was to kill cows. That was part of the religious ceremony. From the time of Buddhism, from the time of the 6th century or so BCE, where vegetarianism in general began to began to gather a lot of strength in India. There were a lot of arguments for vegetarianism. And the cow in some parts of India, in some parts, aspects of Hinduism, was taken as the solution to vegetarianism in the sense that it was an animal that you could eat without killing it. That is to say, you could drink its milk.
Mm.
But many Hindus went on eating beef all through history. It was just only a few. Like there were some Hindus who were ascetics, but everybody else got married and had kids. So too, there were some Hindus who did not eat meat. Some Hindus didn't eat cow in particular. The idea that people who eat cow, who kill cows and eat them, are bad, is basically a 19th century anti-Muslim idea. It was an excuse to kill Muslims. If anyone killed a cow, you killed them. And the Muslims have been, by and large, the butchers of India. So that too is a politically driven rather than religiously driven idea. It comes from the 19th century. It's been picked up recently and used again by the government, but it's not an integral part of Hinduism, and it's not an old part of Hinduism. It's a fairly recent development. And again, it is not shared by most Hindus, many of whom eat meat, many of whom eat beef.
So the Brahmins ate beef,
Some did, sure.
and cows have been domesticated well before organized religion, or at least before Hinduism.
The Rig Veda is all about cows. The Rig Veda is all about getting cows, sacrificing cows, winning cows. I mean, Indo-European mythology is one big cattle raid, starting with the Irish texts and the Greek texts, and so everybody's always stealing everybody else's cows, all through the ancient texts.
So why the holy cow? I mean, they must be getting it from somewhere in scripture.
No, not really. No.
The cow goddess. Cow is my goddess. Where does that come from?
Very late, maybe 19th century. You can find a scripture for it, but it's not an important scripture. It's not in the Mahabharata.
Right.
It's not in Ramayana. It's just a recent. Some people don't like eating cows. We have vegetarians in America too. People are people. So there are some people, but it's never been a central issue of Hinduism. Never.
Right. Excellent. I'm so glad you brought it up. Another fascinating part of your book, and for those of our
another thing, if you ever go to India, you see how people treat cows. They beat them up. They hit them. They get in the way of traffic. People push them around. They don't kill them, but they are not nice to them.
Right.
People in America treat cows much better than people treat cows in India, although they do eventually turn them into hamburgers. So there are all these different complicated issues, I must say. Let me just say that. Okay.
That's a really, really great point, because, a lot of the pushback that we get is, we love animals, and that's why we don't eat beef, because we love animals. And
terrible to animals. God.
You wouldn't eat your dog, so why would you eat your cow? And I don't think that's intellectually honest, Professor.
Well, it's not historically honest.
And you're absolutely right. We're talking about humane treatment of animals.
If you want to see someone in India who has always been vegetarian and has always been very kind to animals, including insects, you follow the Jains. Those are genuine vegetarians. Those are genuine humanitarians. The serious Jains wear masks so they don't accidentally inhale a bug. They have brushes that they brush their paths so they don't accidentally step on a bug. If you want to find people who are serious about not injuring animals and not eating them, look at the Jains. Do not look at the Hindus.
Yeah, very good. Let's talk about your concept, not your concept, but the concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence in Hinduism. I really love the way you broke it down in your book. Explain to the audience what it actually means and why it's different from sort of the Western or the popular understanding of the word nonviolence, as Gandhi perhaps might have practiced it.
Well, Gandhi's a special case too. Gandhi was a brilliant individual. So let's set him apart for a minute and look more at normal Hindus and the word ahimsa. So the verb han means to hit or kill. It's a very interesting ambiguity. You say that person was hatta. You don't know until you read the text more carefully whether he was actually just hit on the head or whether somebody murdered him. So it's a big word, han. Himsa is the desiderative form. It means the desire to harm, the desire to hurt. Ahimsa is the negative. So it means the absence of the desire to hurt. So it's about a state of mind. It's a Buddhist word and a Jain word as well as a Hindu word. It means a kind of calmness and lack of violent thoughts, lack of violent feelings, a kind of compassion for the world. There's also anukaruna, there are karuna, anukrodana. There are words for compassion. And it's really a state of mind which means you lack the desire to hurt anything. It's taken up in some context to mean that you don't want to kill anything. And then it's translated as non-injury, which is only it's not a perfectly accurate translation, but the word comes to mean words change their meaning. So it comes to mean non-injury. It means that you won't hurt anything or kill anything. And it has nothing to do with cows in particular. It also relates to the treatment of human beings as well as to animals in general. You're serious about ahimsa, you don't swat a mosquito.
Yeah, and we have certain individuals in India who have openly on YouTube said that if you kill a cow, if you slit a cow's throat, we will slit your throat. We have people who are suborning murder essentially and saying that we will monetarily reward your families if you get arrested for this sort of thing. I find this to be completely bananas.
It's
because
if you're not going to harm anybody, you're not going to kill anybody. If you don't want anybody to kill cows, you also don't want anybody to kill the people who kill cows. I mean, where does it end? And the idea that it's particularly about cows, it's not about cows. It's about an attitude to living creatures. If you're serious about ahimsa, you're a vegetarian. A lot of people are vegetarians for that reason, and it's a perfectly good thing to do. There are other reasons for being a vegetarian in addition, for concerns for the economy of the world at large. But the impulse that because anytime you eat a steak, it's because some animal was slaughtered, it stops a lot of people from eating steaks, and that's absolutely fine.
But we do it for secular reasons and not for religious reasons.
That's right.
Right.
Religion is a funny thing. You could say a concern for all the living creatures in the world is a religious concern in a way. It's not a Christian or a Jewish or a Hindu concern. It's religious in the broadest sense of the word. It's religious in the sense that you have a care for the planet as a whole, which is not selfish, which is not about yourself. It's that kind of religious idea, but it's not the doctrine or the dogma of any particular religion.
Right. And if the concept of ahimsa is to reduce suffering, I'm absolutely for it. I mean,
you should be a vegetarian.
Yeah, but I also feel like if people do want to eat beef, they should be humanely slaughtered. They should be free range. Even chicken shouldn't be cooked up. These are conversations that we need to have, and we are having. Vice News did a whole expose on how poorly cattle were treated, at certain ranches, in I forget the state, but we don't want to.
Poorly treated in India.
They're poorly treated in India.
I've worked on cattle farms in Ireland. Let me tell you, the Irish treat their cows much better than the Indians treat theirs.
Fascinating.
Although they kill them and eat them. Yeah.
All right. So how are we doing on time? You okay to stick around for a little bit?
Another 10, 15 minutes. Let's do a little bit more.
All right. Excellent. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll line up some questions from the audience. All right, audience. We have 207 people watching us. That's wonderful. Again, the point of this was to have a discussion, to ask questions, both from the perspective of a secular, Hindu, and from the perspective of an outsider, from the perspective of someone like me, who is a student of comparative religion, and also from the perspective of someone who wants to reform, who wants to move things forward, a progressive, if you will. It's not a dirty word. Progress is good for everyone. So we want to talk about these things instead of try to sweep them under the rug and say that's not happening. That's not a problem. It is a problem, and we don't want it to happen. And that's why we're talking about it, because like the professor said, You have to know where you're coming from in order to figure out why you're where you are. If you just keep saying there's not a problem, we do this in the West, Professor Doniger. There isn't a gun problem in America. There isn't a income inequality problem in America. This denial, it gets us nowhere. So couple more things. I grew up with a lot of Hindus as best friends. I'd never heard of this thing called Sanatan Dharma until very recently. Eternal belief. Why is it that Hindus have now started calling themselves Sanatan, Sanatani? Is it because of the British connotation? Because it was an exonym that the foreigner, the white man, started calling everybody from that region Indus Hindu? Is that the reason, or is it because it represents a very sort of specific fundamentalist kind of Hinduism?
So dharma, that's a complicated question. So dharma means the way things ought to be, the way things aren't but should be. It means justice. It means right behavior, doing the right thing. Sometimes it means religious law. And adharma is being wrong, doing bad things. It's a very broad word, has a lot of different connotations. There are also two different types of dharma right from the start. There is swadharma, which is one's own particular dharma, which is a very basic concept. So if you're a woman, you have a different dharma from a man. If you're a child, you have a different dharma from a grown-up. If you're a sick person or an invalid, you have a different dharma for someone who is older or is well. If you're a butcher, you have a different dharma for someone who is a librarian. Mm-hmm. So in the true sense of Hinduism, in that sense of Hinduism, which is that it's so different and has so many different variations, everyone has a different dharma. And the Bhagavad Gita says, Krishna says to Arjuna, your own dharma as a warrior is to fight and kill the enemy. Don't worry about some other dharma. Do your own job and don't worry about it. And if you do it without bad feelings, you'll be right. So that's the real meaning of it. It's not so much even caste. Caste comes into it as well. A butcher has a different dharma from a priest, but also it's male and female, young and old. There are many different dharmas as there are human beings almost. There are categories. In addition, there is the idea of a dharma for everybody, which is sometimes called sadharana dharma, the dharma held in common, which is things that everybody should do, such as telling the truth, being good to your parents. It's very much like the Ten Commandments or any basic code of ethics. You don't have to be a genius to figure it out. And indeed, killing is against the rule and so forth. Lying is against the rules and so forth. But there are times when one's individual dharma conflicts with the big dharma, the general dharma, as in the case of a butcher, as in the case of a warrior. Killing is against dharma, but some people have as their own dharma killing. And that is a conflict that people try to work out in 1,000 ways. The Mahabharata is all about how it is impossible to obey dharma, that everyone comes to moments when they have to break some rule or other. To do your own dharma, you get in trouble with the general dharma. It's impossible to be good. My friend Gurcharan Das wrote a book called The Possibility of Being Good, or about dharma and so forth. So that's what dharma is really about. It's about the war within each of us between the desire to adhere to a universal ethic, which is not hard to figure out, and individual constraints which make it necessary sometimes to tell a lie, it does seem, and necessary sometimes to kill someone, it appears. So that's the real dharma. The idea of Sanatan Dharma comes in the late 19th century in Bengal under the influence of Unitarian ministers in Unitarianism in general. when some upper class Bengalis, mostly Brahmins, were in some ways parroting, playing up to the British, were influenced by Unitarianism and tried to argue that true Dharma had the virtues of Unitarianism, of being just a good person, and that Hinduism was that Hinduism had the quality of being a particular Dharma, and that in a way it was a way to stand Hinduism up against Christianity.
Hmm.
In a particular part of India at a particular moment in time. And that idea was never really important anyplace else until recently it was picked up again largely by the government and by a certain type of people who adhere to government ideas, that Hinduism is Sanatana Dharma, that all of Hindus believe in it, that all Hindus believe in the same thing. They believe in being good to their mothers, they believe in not lying and so forth, which is of course true. I mean, we all believe in those things and we're all bad to our mothers sometimes. So that's why Sanatana Dharma doesn't have any real meaning as a religious idea. It has meaning as a political idea, which is that Hinduism is a religion which believes in being a good person in the same way that Unitarianism does.
Right. Right.
And it's a political rather than a religious concept. Yeah.
Fascinating. No, it absolutely is. It's the to coin a word, a Shariaification
Mm-hmm.
of Hinduism, because there is Islam, there's wonderful Muslims. I was born to a Muslim woman. My mother, she's lovely. If she's watching, hi mother. But there is that political.
Good to your mother. That's part of Dharma. That was a dharmic act you just did.
You see, and this is what this is all about, ladies and gentlemen. This is all about having a discussion and realizing, we need to pitch a big tent. We don't need to create, I don't want to use the cult word, but we don't want to create tribes within tribes and divide and speaking of divide and rule, I want to talk about the British for a second, Professor Doniger. There are a couple of things that are very sensitive issues for our Hindu friends, and one of them is sati. A lot of people, even serious scholars, claim that sati was they conflate or confuse that with the concept of Johar, which was when the Mughals invaded, Hindu princesses set themselves on fire to protect their chastity, their honor. That's a completely different thing. Some blame the British. Now, as someone who grew up in England, you asked me about my accent. I have a lot of things to say about the British. Some complimentary, some not so complimentary, right? And we can, and we should.
The Hindu Raj was not England's finest moment.
Right. Absolutely. So we're not here trying to glorify the empire. The sun has set on the British Empire. So let's get that out of the way. But the concept of sati, Professor Doniger, where does it come from? I understand it's not practiced. When I was a kid, I watched a couple of movies where they would do that, set the woman on fire because she didn't bring enough dowry. This apparently actually happened in certain parts of India. So where does the concept of sati and this whole thing? I know that Shiva's wife was the first sati. She was literally sati, the goddess, and then she threw herself on the ceremonial fire because her father was disrespectful to Lord Shiva, and then she reincarnated as Parvati. So I know that. I know about the Agni Pariksha in the Ramayana. But where does this sati thing come from, and to what extent how do Hindus feel about it in today's day and age?
Sati was never widely practiced in India ever at all, ever. It occurs in the epics as something that the wives of great kings did. In the Mahabharata, we're told that Krishna had 16,000 wives, and when he died, they all committed sati and so forth. And so it's a mythological thing by and large. As you say, there's Johar, and there was a tradition among some of the warrior Rajasthan tribes that rather than be raped, the women would indeed kill themselves, but it was never widespread. In the 19th century, when the British John Company became politically the British Raj,
Right.
the British were hard pressed to show that they had the moral upper hand in ruling India. And part of their argument was to say that the Indians were immoral and wicked people, and thank God the British had come to India to make them good people and to show them how to behave. And they made a tremendous fuss out of the few times when sati was in fact committed, very rarely, and sometimes, as you say, for dowries. There were times when women were indeed murdered for their dowries. The British made such a fuss about it that the occurrence of sati increased enormously through copycat crimes. They had publicity. People who had never heard of it before, and Hindus who had never heard of it said, wow, look what these people are doing. So under the British, sati increased rather than decreased. The British did not invent it, nor was it ever general in India. And it was kind of an extreme thing that was done from time to time, and it was enormously publicized by the British to justify their presence in India. Women have been murdered for their dowries, and some of them were forced to pretend to commit sati. Murder goes on all the time everywhere. But the idea that any good Hindu woman would allow herself to be burned alive on her husband's funeral pyre was simply not true. It was done by the great mythological queens in the epics. It was done for a while in Bengal in order to get women's dowries. It's probably done from time to time. There was a time in the 20th century, in the 50s, when there was a notorious sati. Again, a great deal of publicity. It's not a typical part of Hinduism. There is this scriptural precedent for it in the Queens in the Mahabharata, but it was very seldom ever done, and the British made a great song and dance about it as part of their general argument that thank God they got to India to save India from
The savages.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
And Professor, isn't that the famous quote when I forget who it was? Obviously, I'm pretty sure that someone will look it up, and you might be able to help as well. But when they hung people who forced their wives to commit sati, there was a protest, and the British gentleman said in his most lordly British accent that they said, you say this is your culture. Well, this is our culture, that we hang people who force their women to burn themselves alive. This was a quote from a gentleman. I forget who it was, but Rustam Shah, Simone Shitij, one of you, please look it up. I'm terrible with names sometimes.
I know, but I know the stories.
So there was no peer pressure to commit sati. Okay, excellent. Let's talk about a couple more things, and we'll take a few questions, and we will. And thanks again. As you can see, we have more people watching this show than we've ever had on any one of our shows, and there's people who started out being very hostile, and I can't even keep up with the comments, but they're saying, oh, we didn't think she would say these things. We expected her to be a Hindu hater. So my Indian friends, there's a thing called nuance, and we really need to sort of really understand the meaning of nuance. Part of it is because you're white, Professor, so there's that kind of distrust of an outsider talking down to me, telling me about my religion. But I kid you not when I say that Professor Doniger is one of the world's foremost scholars on Hinduism, and she's dedicated her entire life to this subject. And she did.
Lots of people know things about Hinduism I don't know. Every Hindu knows something about Hinduism I don't know. We just know different things. I know some things they don't know. They know lots of things I don't know. There's not a contest here. We're in it together.
Absolutely. We can all learn from one another, but the way forward is to keep an open mind and not to immediately label someone who might have things to say about your religion that you might find embarrassing as a hater. I get the same thing from my Muslim brothers and sisters. They call me Islamophobic. I said the term is meaningless because a phobia is an irrational fear. I don't leave the house because of Islam. Islam is going to come and get me. It's nonsense. We need to be able to criticize, analyze, dissect religion, because that's how we move forward. So, a couple more questions, and we'll take some from the audience as well. We talked about sati. I really appreciate your response. We talked about the cow. We talked about the revivalist movement in Hinduism. Actually, we've got quite a few out of the way. Actually, let's talk about the caste system. Was that a British construct? To what extent did the British exploit the caste system, which is present in Hinduism? That is a fundamental tenet of Hinduism. To what extent did the British exploit it?
Exploit is very different from constructing. The idea that the British invented the caste system is, of course, nonsense. The caste system is very old in India. It takes many different sorts of forms. It was in place when the British came to India. The British used it and exacerbated it. The British had their own caste system. The British loved the caste system. It made life so much easier for them. They themselves came from a world in which there was enormous division between the castes and so forth. And they learned to choose the Brahmins. They knew how to find the upper caste people that they needed for their work. They knew how to find the people, the caste that were going to be useful for soldiers, the caste that are going to be useful for servants, and so forth. So their own classism, really, which was not quite the same as caste, played into it very much. And I wouldn't say it made it any worse, but in some ways, it exacerbated the tensions between castes in India, but it did not invent it at all. The British were great. In my book about horses, I talked about people who breed horses and people who breed dogs, and how if you breed dogs and horses, you care very much about who their sire and dam is, otherwise is known as father and mother, and indeed who their grandparents are, and so forth. So as these great horsey and doggy people, the British felt that you needed to know whose parents when you wanted to know someone, you needed to know who his parents were. And so the caste system worked very well for them, because that's who you were. You were the son of your father and the son and the grandson of your grandfather. And by using certain castes for soldiers, certain castes for servants, they probably made it a little worse. But it was always there. It had been there for centuries. And indeed, in some ways, they produced legislation which tried to make things better for the lowest caste. The people used to be called untouchables. And when the government of India became free and independent after the British left in 1948, they instituted laws to give the untouchables, now called Dalits or the scheduled castes or other backward castes, they gave them all sorts of words, just as people of color in America kept finding new words for themselves because the old words were always polluted by racism. So too, the British found these other words for the lowest castes and did something to help them. And then the Indian government did more to help them. And indeed, if there's anything good to be said about the present government of India, and I have very little good to say of it, I will say that they have done a great deal to elevate the lowest caste, the caste that had been most inhumanely treated. There is a real improvement today. You see people who used to be called untouchables in all sorts of positions of importance in India, and that's partly due to the government of India over the last 50 or 60 years, including the present government. Can we hold on for 1 minute?
Absolutely.
Hello? Okay. Is this Alan? Okay, there he is. There he goes. See you later. Okay, that's the lady who walks my dog. All right.
Excellent.
Back to the caste system.
Right. So we have, I'm so glad we're doing this, because again, there is this sort of knee-jerk response to any sort of open discussion if we started, if I had a bell and a tika and was wearing a, like a saffron, thing, then we'd have 1,000, live viewers. But again, we're not here to bash a religion or a group of people. I hope that you were able to gauge from Professor Doniger's opening and the way she's described, and again, there's that word again, nuance. It's all about nuance. Professor Doniger, if you will, I would like to read a small passage from your American Girl in India Letters and Recollections.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. So I want everyone to please pay attention to this. All right. This gentleman here says that I will look good in a tika and Hindu robes. I will try it. Believe me, I will be accused of pandering by my atheist friends, and we don't pander on this channel. We tell it like it is. But I wanted to read this. This is from your letter dated November 1st, 1963, and this is sort of a part of it, right from the middle. Several things together have made it possible for me to be at home here. I have finally realized that it is not necessary to love everything about India in order to love India, any more than it is at home or in a person. Being a hero worshiper and idealizer by nature, this is not as obvious for me as it may seem. And I think I will probably have to re-win the same battle many times again, but I have won this round at least. The lotus flower grows in mud is the Indian expression, and the glory of Indian religion grows in blood and poverty. I have learned to see the lotus through the mud, so to speak, and this is the worthwhile aspect of what I spoke of as impossible before. Seeing is striking only what is striking to an Indian. It will always be impossible for me not to react to the things that are striking to me, but not to them. I cannot help reacting to a naked man or a woman nursing a child or a tropical sunset or a dancer in ecstasy. But in a positive way, I am learning to react in addition to the things which are significant to them and which were at first obscured to me by the insignificant facts of Indian life. I love that. I love that. I love that. It is not necessary to love everything about India in order to love India. You can replace that India with anything.
Yeah.
It is not, it is not necessary for me to love, America. Wait, let me go back and read that. It is not necessary for me to love everything about America in order to love America. That's what love is. Because otherwise,
I thought it was that I was disappointed. I thought I love Indian food, I love Indian music, I love everything. And when I actually got to real live India, I found things that I didn't love, and I felt so bad. I felt it was a failure. What's the matter with me? How have I not managed to love this? What's the matter with me that I don't love everything? And when I lived there for a while, I realized that that's how one loves the people one loves too. You do know they have faults. You do know they're not perfect, but still you love them. And that was one of the lessons I learned in India. And I still love India very much. It's still my favorite place. I'm sorry I can't go back there anymore. I still have friends in India I talk to all the time. I still read about India. I still write about India. India is still very, very at the heart of me. But India right now is a place which is not possible for me to live in anymore. And I'm sorry.
and a lot of it is because of this book, this wonderful, wonderful book that I absolutely adore. It's an epic. This is the kind of book, Professor Doniger, that I will take to the beach, and people are asking me, you got a Stephen King guy over here, you got a John Grisham guy over here, and I'm reading this. They're like, what are you reading?
It's kind of a heavy book to carry to the beach, but I appreciate the spirit in which you said it.
I've got the audio book and the actual book, but I'm from the old school. It's for me, I have to have the book in front of me because the eyes work very differently from the ears. Yeah. You can take in multiple stimuli from the ears. Like right now, I'm listening to you and I'm reading these.
I wrote it because I really did love India, and I I wanted to present to the world the India that I loved, which was not the India that was being broadcast by the BJP at that time.
Right. And I think the BJP,
Yeah.
yeah, and this is my opinion. This is not Professor Doniger's opinion. This is my opinion. I think the BJP is one of the worst things to happen to India in a very long time. I think the Hindutva movement is going to turn India into another Pakistan. And I have lived in Pakistan. And believe me, you don't want that. You absolutely
The bad guys
don't
may
want
not win. There are still a lot of very good people in India fighting against it. You don't know how it ain't over till it's over.
Yeah.
There's a big fight going on in
And
India.
that's why we want to do this. That's why we want to push back. Professor, let me ask you something. Let's take a couple of quick questions, and then we'll take your closing statements. We're at 1 hour and 30 minutes, which is perfect. Let's see here. Rustam Shah wants to know if you could tell us how old Hinduism is, or the Vedas or the Puranas.
The roots of Hinduism are in the Rig Veda. Hindus today still chant one hymn from the Rig Veda, and that can be dated about 1500 BCE. We don't know exactly, but something like that. But that's only a small part of Hinduism. So that the part of Hinduism that you might encounter in any part of India might be just 100 years old or even 10 years old. Hinduism has continued to change. But that oldest text, which has in it the seeds of a great deal of Hindu thought, not yet ideas of transformation or anything like that, but has something of it in, mentions the god Indra, the worship, the god Agni. So there are pieces of Hinduism that are already in the Rig Veda, and that is 1500 years old at least.
Wonderful. Next question. What do you think of Charvaka philosophy, or atheistic philosophy of Hindus?
That's an interesting question. I wrote a book called Against Dharma, which is about the history of ideas in India which challenge some of the central concepts. And the Charvakas are very interesting. They're logicians, they're atheists. And there are very ancient texts where these people say there are no gods, the gods don't exist, and so forth. They're mainly made up by other people who say, there are these people there who say there are no gods. We have a few Charvaka texts. They did exist. Amartya Sen thinks they're part of the ancient logical tradition of India. So it was always good that some Hindus knew that there were atheists, super logical atheists, who said, you can't prove to me there's a God. So I think it's an important thread of Hinduism, which always made available the idea that there were serious philosophers who were atheists, but it was never a really important part of India. It was never a major sect. It was sort of a small group of people who only existed for a while and then became sort of mythologized. But an important piece of mythology. They were an idea that it was possible to be an atheist and be a Hindu, which I think is a
Right.
good idea, but they were not a major sect.
Yeah, I hear this from a lot of people who call in and they say, well, you can be a Hindu and still be an atheist, Gnostic, and all of that. And I say, well, if you're an atheist, then you're not a Hindu, because atheism literally means without belief in God, atheos.
Oh, I think you can be an atheist and be a Hindu. Sure.
There you go, cultural Hindu, right?
Sure, sure.
But if I'm an atheist and if I want to have a Big Mac, then I should be allowed to. But if I can't, then
Not if you're a vegetarian atheist.
that's right. But if you're a meat-eating atheist, then there's a problem. All right, one more question here from John Stopman. Some Hindus told me that in the end they believe in one God because their many gods are all representations of the one God Brahma. Please ask Professor Doniger if that is correct.
Yeah, a lot of Hindus believe that. That in a sense, it's not so much Brahma as Brahman, which is the Godhead, the ultimate reality, as Paul Tillich called it, the Atman, the soul of the universe. And in a sense, I think most Hindus believe that Shiva and Vishnu, they do exist, and so does Devi, and so does all these different people we worship, Ganesha, and all of them, that they are, in a sense, ultimately part of the universal Godhead. And that's I think, a widespread Indian belief. That you believe that the gods exist, but they're part of a much larger reality of the universe, which is divine in a very important sense, and we're all part of it. I think that's a very widespread Hindu belief, and it does not
Yeah.
in any way conflict with polytheism.
Right. And a lot of people, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, don't realize this, but Hinduism isn't necessarily a polytheistic religion. It's a henotheistic religion where they've got the three, the Trinity, or the three Deva, and, you know, you've got all these other gods that and whose existence is acknowledged and even welcomed.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. So this is a question from Nidish Kumar. This is something that is brought up a lot. As an atheist, I fully support BJP. Nidish, I don't think you're an atheist. Otherwise, they will turn India into another Pakistan. I think the BJP will turn India into another Pakistan. But anyway, this is the part that I find interesting. Professor, you have some personal experience with Nazism, with this ideology.
Well, I'm not as old as that.
Not personal, as I mean, you know, some background. Let's just say some background, some cultural background. You are, and that's why I think this is interesting, because I don't want to talk about this, but I hear this argument quite a lot. If you have to fight Hitler, you need Stalin, not impotent a-holes like Gandhi and his stupid ideologies. Now, this is also a very, this is a recent development. The person that shot Gandhi was a Hindutva, was an RSS fanatic. And Nidish, maybe you need to read your history again, because Stalin murdered and obliterated millions of people. In fact, that is the one thing that religious people keep, you know, pushing back on. They say, well, atheists have killed a lot of people too, which, you know, I'm going to do a stream about this. First of all, Hitler wasn't an atheist, and neither was Stalin. Stalin believed that he was God, which is an atheism. But what do you have to say about this, Professor? You need one, you know, one evil to fight another, or a bigger bully to fight another bully. What do you think about that?
I think Gandhi was remarkably effective in hurrying the British along.
Can you see this comment, Professor?
I think.
Yes, can you see this comment?
I did indeed. Okay. I think that the British were going to leave India anyway, and that after World War II it became important. But I think Gandhi did a great deal to make it happen sooner, and he tried in vain to make it happen bloodlessly. So I'm a great admirer of Gandhi.
As am I.
I think he was an extraordinary man and a good man, and I think he did more good than harm, and he did really quite a lot of good. So I wouldn't liken him to Stalin or Hitler or anybody else. And I think the European ideologies are not really appropriate to the history of India at any time, including in the modern period. So I think Gandhi's world was another world from ours, and perhaps we do need other kinds of heroes nowadays. I think we need brave newspaper people and brave publishers and brave scholars and brave writers to mobilize the considerable goodwill of the people of India who do not hate Muslims and who do not want to kill anybody. I think that there are a lot of good people in India working very hard to keep it a great democratic nation. And I'm all for them. And I wrote my book in order to help them, in order to tell a story of Hinduism which was different from the story that was being told by the people who wanted to make India a Hindu nation. So I don't think about Stalins and Hitlers in India. I think about Gandhis in India, and I think about all the good people who are there now, working very hard to keep India a great democratic nation.
Very well said. My final question to you, Professor, and thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy day to come and talk to me. I know you said you had people visiting. I really appreciate it. It's elevated the channel. It's elevated the discourse. A lot of people who came here expecting Hindu bashing or Hindu phobia, again, that's not a thing, have mentioned in the comments that they were surprised by, how rational this conversation was. Because again, the point of this whole thing is that, first of all, I thought, Professor, that the whole drama behind this book was just batshit. Sorry to swear, but it was batshit.
Sold a lot of copies.
Sold a lot of copies.
Said there is no such thing as bad publicity.
That's right, P.T. Barnum. Yes, but your book has a lot more integrity than anything P.T. Barnum ever did.
I have a great friend, P.T. Barnum. I won't hear a word against P.T. Barnum.
Okay, fair enough. No, but I think the point of this gentleman's, argument was that the Muslim minority in India are becoming very fundamentalist, and we're working on it, Nidish. Believe me, we work on it every day. I do it in Hindi, even though I'm more comfortable speaking English. I do a show every Sunday in Hindi with an Indian ex-Muslim named Zafar Heretic. And we talk to Muslims and we argue with them and we get into it. So we're working on it. We want rational Muslims, but the answer isn't everybody gets into bed with Hindutva, because Hindutva doesn't want a secular India, like the professor just said. Hindutva wants Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu state. Why do you want a Hindu state? Why do you want any kind of a religious state? As if there was ever any agreement between, religious people, first of all right? Like, the religious people never ever fought any wars together. Anyway, I could go on and on about this, but I won't. I'd like to, again, thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure.
It was my pleasure. I was glad, and I hope it changed some people's minds about some things.
Professor, I think it will. My final question, well, not my final question, because I'm sure I'll be emailing you with more, but to sort of, end this episode, what is your, the one thing that is clear, that is unimpeachable, is your love for India, your love for Indian culture, your love for Hinduism. It's unimpeachable. What is your message to India, to the Indians that are watching you, will be watching you, to the Hindus, to the secular people of India? How do you want them to, if there's a way for you to say, look, this book, maybe you misunderstood it, go back and read it again, or anything, what is your message to the people of India?
Well, I think that is the message. It's silly for me to say something in one sentence now, and I've spent my whole life reading books. I've said what I've thought in the Hindus, and I've said what I've thought in other books as well, that Hinduism is a great living religion. It is not anti-Muslim. There's no reason why Hindus should be against Muslims. Most Hindus have not been against Muslims. There's no reason why India cannot continue to support a thriving Hindu population and a thriving Muslim population as well, as it has for ever so long, for so many centuries. So I think there's hope. I think that the historical record shows that it's been happening all these many years. And I have hope that there will be peace between them finally, and that the Muslims will be able to live in peace in India as they have for so long. That's my
All right. That's wonderful. Wonderful. And thank you once again, Professor. Wendy Doniger, ladies and gentlemen. Here is her latest book. Let me share the screen here so you can check it out. It's on Amazon. Highly recommended. Beautiful, beautiful collection of letters from the heart. She's 22 years old. She goes and lives in Shanti Niketan, which is the sort of the village that Rabindranath Tagore's father. It's almost like he started that a village, if you will. Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I off? Am I?
Yep.
Okay. And the letters are, like she said, the raw, unfiltered experience, but you can sort of trace the growth and sort of the maturity, if you will. And people grow and they mature, and it's all about nuance. It's all about layers. There's, so stop looking at black and white, and stop, it's easy to be pandered to, but I what can I say now? I want to keep this academic, but let's have some nuance, and let's pay attention to. I mean, let's write down what the professor just said about unity, about peace, about secularism. It's not a dirty word. I wish I were a little bit more eloquent than that before I leave you guys, but that's it. All right, guys. Thanks very much, Professor. Any parting thoughts?
Nope, just that. Just that.
All right, guys. So like the show, subscribe. We're gonna keep doing interesting shows in English and Hindi. And thanks for everyone that joined us. Thank you, Professor Doniger. And we will see you guys next time. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray.